preventing refrigerants from being released into the atmosphere, and installing onshore wind turbines. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about what's being done to prevent wasted food in the US. At the national level, during the Obama administration, the US Environmental Protection Agency and the US Department of Agriculture recognized the immense environmental, economic, and social challenges presented by wasted food. And they announced together the nation's first ever food loss and waste reduction goal, which is to reduce per capita food waste by 50% by the year 2030. And on Earth Day last week, both agencies reaffirmed their commitment to working together toward this goal. Also in 2018, the EPA established the Winning on Reducing Food Waste Initiative, which was signed by the EPA, the USDA, and the US Food and Drug Administration. And under that initiative, these federal agencies agreed to coordinate efforts and leverage government resources to reduce food loss and waste. And that includes actions to educate Americans on the impacts and the importance. The EPA and the USDA also continue to work with major food-related businesses who have pledged to reduce food loss waste in their US operations by 50% by 2030 through a program called the US Food Loss and Waste 2030 Champions. And some of those companies are shown here on this slide, and they're all pretty much household names. Next slide, please. ReFed, which is a national nonprofit, is working to end food loss and waste across the US food system. And earlier this month, the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic, and the World Wildlife joined forces with ReFed, and they developed and introduced the US Food Loss and Waste Policy Action Plan with 5 key actions that the Biden administration and Congress can take to help reach our national food waste reduction goal. And those actions are listed here, and I'll tell you a little bit about what's under each of these. So number 1, investing in prevention and keeping waste out of landfills by doing things like offering funding for states and cities to incentivize the measurement, rescue, recycling, and prevention of food waste, building demand for compost, which we'll hear about from one of our speakers today, and eliminating barriers to feeding food scraps to animals. Second, facilitating food donation. And we could do this by expanding federal enhanced tax deduction for food donation, enabling greater food donation by farmers, strengthening liability protections for food donation, clarifying guidance on food safety for donations, and also increasing regional food supply chain coordination. The third recommended action in the plan is showing increased US leadership at home and abroad. And we could do this through actions like requiring federal facilities to measure, rescue, recycle, and prevent food waste. Fourth recommendation is educating and activating consumers. So consumers, which may surprise you, consumers are by far the largest source of food waste in the United States, with 37% of food waste happening at the household level. So more must be done to educate consumers on the steps they can take to reduce their waste and empower them to make a difference. The NRDC's Save the Food campaign was developed with the purpose of raising awareness and educating consumers on how to waste less food at home. And the EPA worked with the West Coast Forum on Climate and Materials Management to develop the Food Too Good to Waste toolkit for households. So these and other resources can help Americans make critical changes in their homes to reduce food waste, and we need to get that, that message communicated. And finally, standardized national date labeling. So studies show that date label confusion is one of the leading causes of food waste, causing Americans to prematurely toss food that's still safe to eat and contributing to additional waste among grocery stores and other consumer-facing businesses. So Words like best if used by, or best if used before, or sell by, or use by on food packaging, these are all indicators of best flavor or freshness or peak quality, or how long a store should display a product for sale, or they're used for inventory management. These are not safety dates. There is an exception, which is infant formula, where it is related to safety. But we need consistent, federally standardized labels and education for both consumers and businesses. And if you want more details specifically on the labeling issue, you can visit stopfoodwaste.org. That's a great resource. Next slide. Now I'll talk a little bit about what the EPA is doing specifically to address the impacts of wasted food both in our society and in our environment. EPA developed the food recovery hierarchy pictured here, and you'll see this in a lot of presentations and documentaries about food waste. And it represents the concept that the greatest environmental and societal benefits are achieved at the top levels of this pyramid. And that's when we're focusing on preventing food from being wasted in the first place. We also want to make sure that any surplus food gets donated to feed our neighbors in need in our communities. That's why it's near the top of the pyramid. I mentioned the Food to Get to Waste Toolkit developed with the West Coast Forum. That's our household focused initiative. We also, the Pacific Northwest Regional Office, we've developed school food share guides for states, and we've done that working with boards of education and state departments of health to help schools be able to divert surplus food to feed first hungry school children, then donate whatever's left over to local hunger relief agencies. Next slide. And then finally, for businesses and institutions, our commercial facing program is EPA's Food Recovery Challenge. And the challenge has participants pledge to improve their sustainable food management practices and report their results. And we provide recognition and awards to that program. And this slide shows you that lots of very well-known entities in the Pacific Northwest are already enrolled in the program, and we're recruiting more. You've got large businesses, sports and entertainment venues, universities, hospitals, pretty much any type of business or institution that generates lots of food waste or has food service operations is eligible to join. Next slide. I've included on this slide some of the best and most useful resources that are out there that are available to assist businesses and institutions with food recovery. The EPA Sustainable Management of Food website is a great place to start. That's linked to that is on my final slide. And you can find links there to lots of other great resources like the CEC's North American Initiative on Food Waste Reduction and Recovery, the NRDC's Save the Food program, Further with Food, the EPA's Interactive Excess Food Opportunities Map, which displays almost 1.2 million potential sources of excess food in the US. And that includes grocery stores, event venues, hotels, restaurants, universities. And it also includes 4,000 hunger relief agencies, as well as composters and anaerobic digestion facilities. And so communities and businesses and organizations are all using this map to identify alternatives to sending excess food to landfills. There's also the EPA Food Stewards Pledge, which is an ongoing effort by EPA to engage with the faith-based community and raise awareness about with their congregations and their members about impacts of wasted food on the environment. And feel free to reach out to me afterwards, and I'd be happy to connect you with any of these resources. It's such a strange thing, this pandemic. This morning, I was thinking about this Zoom meeting this afternoon, and I had the random thought that, oh, I better put a bunch of business cards in my wallet for the thing today. And then I realized that I wasn't going anywhere. I wouldn't need any business cards. But you're welcome to reach out via phone or email, and I can certainly get you more information if you'd like. And then last slide, please. So just to wrap up, because food waste occurs at every stage of the food supply chain, including at businesses and in homes, the strategies to reduce food waste have to come from all sectors and all regions. So we all have a part to play in helping the U.S. reach our goal of 50% reduction in wasted food by 2030. And that plays actually a major part in helping us achieve our goals under the Paris Climate Agreement. So through our collective efforts, we can both manage food more sustainably and help solve the hunger crisis in America. So please feel free to contact me anytime. And thank you again for inviting me to participate on this panel today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic. That was great. 13% of greenhouse gases from food waste. Wow, that's a lot. So thanks. And yeah, as you see, we're already getting some questions. And for those who joined a little late, what we're doing is going to go through all the panelists and then we'll ask questions. If you have questions, put them in the chat and then we will get to those. But next is Heather Trim, who many of you know. And Heather, you want to introduce yourself and then let her go.
Great. Hey, thanks, Mike and Dominic. I'm Heather Trim, Executive Director of Zero Waste Washington. So great to see such a big crowd. I know many of you. So is this advancing? It's not advancing. Let's get to advance. There we go. So we are a statewide nonprofit. Our goal is to make trash obsolete, and we do that primarily by working on laws at the city, the county, the state, and now the federal level a bit. We do research projects and we do community-based pilot projects. We have 7 focus areas. I'm not talking about most of these today, but I draw your attention to the top left-hand corner, which is producer responsibility, where the manufacturer pays for the end of life. And the reason I bring your attention to that is because there's a new law that went into, this is a side advertisement right now. There's a new law that went into effect in November. And so your leftover medicine can now be taken to the pharmacy, the sheriff's office, or the hospital. You go online and look for MedPro and put in your address. And this is now available statewide. It was 10 years in the making and hundreds of people helped make it happen, many of you. And it's very exciting to have had that go into effect. And then just a few weeks ago, the paint product stewardship program went into effect in Washington State. And again, you can look online for paint care and find where to send your leftover paint to be recycled if it's latex into new paint. And if it's oil-based, the idea is that it would be reusable and put up on the shelf and given away for free, or it's going to be treated as hazardous material. So this evening, I'm going to talk about the challenge, and I'm going to skip through some of that since Dominic really did set us up nicely. How do we stop the food at the source, feeding hungry people, and then really much of the time on organic waste management and policy. So in terms of the challenge, in addition to the environmental impacts, there's also just a huge economic impact from the amount of dollars when you throw away a resource, and then also the amount of fresh water used if you're throwing away food that was produced with that fresh water. This is from ReFed, that group, the think tank that Dominic referenced. This is from EPA, and it is showing that that municipal solid waste landfills are the 3rd largest source of human-related methane emissions in the United States. I'm going to speak more about methane in a moment, but it is a big deal. This is part of that, which is that a few years ago, California, actually I guess last year, California did the NASA data thing where they looked at what were the top methane emitters in the state. And they were very surprised because they did not think that landfills were going to be the top. And it turned out that the top in what they call the 2% club were Republic Services landfill, look at that, and then Waste Connections, which is a landfill, California Resources, I don't know what that is, and then Waste Management, which is a landfill. So in California, they basically turned the tables on the conventional thinking in fact, that landfills really are more important in this discussion. And just a few days ago, the New York Times did a very important article on this topic. People have been really focused on CO2, but methane really needs to be better addressed, and we really need to start paying way more attention to it. And they said that a major UN report is coming out in about a month. That was the point of the article. As you all probably know, methane is way more potent than CO2 in terms as a greenhouse gas. So here in the state, we subscribe to basically what Domenic said, a three-pronged strategy. One, reduce the waste, the organic waste at the source. Let's just have less of it to begin with. Two, let's make sure that that edible food is rescued. And then three, let's do something with the inedible waste. And of course, I wanted to put a cute picture of pigs because feeding pigs is part of the strategy. If you were doubtful that there is such a thing as food waste, we have been doing a study in the city of Burien on food waste, and we did waste audits, as you can see during the pandemic, of restaurants there looking at their food waste. And here are just some photos from that waste audit. There's just a lot of food that people, when they go to, these are things that people would have thrown away when they were eating on site at the restaurants. There's just so much food waste that you kind of don't feel it all the time necessarily. So let's start with stopping at the source. The waste and food loss, as Domenic said, it's kind of a big word, big phrase to say. And the point of this is, where is the food waste occurring? Is it occurring at the home, or is it occurring elsewhere in the system? And you can see in the United States, it is the outer yellow circle, the bigger circle for the US or for the North America, is discarded by consumers. However, and so the argument, and this older slide, this older data, is that it was the westernized countries were kind of had a different type of problem. But just on March 4th, the UN published their UN Food Waste Index, which I think is a repeated study, but they just did their new one. And what they found was that 900, well, first off, they found that there was 2 times the previous estimate of food waste. And interestingly, that the household per capita food waste generation was actually broadly similar across country incomes. So that was new finding, fresh, hot off the press, which does make you take notice. Now, ReFed, who Domenic mentioned earlier, is a think tank that works on food waste policy, food policy. And they just came out with a brand new report. And one of the takeaways is that Americans throw away 5 billion bananas a year. That's a lot of bananas. They have 40 recommendations, and one of their top lines is that if we do an investment of 14 billion per year over the next decade, we can eliminate, and I can't even read my slide because my things are on top of it, 45 million tons of food waste, and that would result in a 73 billion per year economic benefit, a 5-to-1 return. And it also has significant greenhouse gas benefits. This is from their website and their report, and I'm not going to, and I know it's going to be hard to read, but I just want to draw your attention that they show from the point of view of net financial benefit, that the biggest benefits come from reducing the food in the first place, the waste in the first place, and then rescue and then recycling, which would be like compost and energy generation. So here is an example table from their graph from their report on the top 10. They do a variety of things which are called top 10 solutions. This is greenhouse gas emissions avoided. And you can see that the #1 thing here is portion sizes. Having restaurants and homes reduce your portion size. And I think that photo I showed you before kind of demonstrates that. Second is meal kits. Third is consumer education campaigns. Then centralized composting, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, et cetera. So this is, I think, a really great report that they did. And Domenic mentioned this, and we did take a run at this at the state level last year, not this year, 2021, but in 2020. Representative Beth Dolio led the charge on this bill, 2651, to address food waste labels. We knew that it was probably not going to pass as a legislative bill because it was sort of a first introduction of the concept. And it's also super controversial and has some opposition. But the idea is that people are very confused by those food date labels. And Walmart did a survey of their private label suppliers and found that they had as many as 47 different kinds of date labels on their various products. That's pretty bad. And another study done, again, a little bit old, but probably still very relevant, is that the consumer confusion can account for 20% of consumer waste. You know, people see like it has a date on it. Oh, I must throw it away, instead of actually smelling it and seeing if it's still good, because the label does not actually relate to the safety of the food. It's the optimum date for the food, not the safety date. The only product in the United States that's required to have a date label for safety is infant formula. We do have a law related to milk, a pull date, but that's different than an expiration date. And California passed a similar law, but it was strictly voluntary. Ours was not going to be voluntary, which hence the controversy. So the Grocery Manufacturers Association, who kind of deals with a lot of this, basically said, okay, we're going to do it voluntarily. And they got people together to standardize the labeling. And in theory, in January, right before we were working on this bill a year ago, this was supposed to be in effect. So I went to the grocery store. Whoops. Okay, sorry. First, let me tell you what the law said. So the bill that we were trying to get passed would have said that there would need to be two standard labels, one related to food quality and one related to food safety. Food quality, it would need to say best if used by, or best if used or frozen by. And for food safety, it would have needed to have said use by, or use or freeze by. So this would be standard, and this is in line with what is being proposed at the national level and in California. So this was not anything ground shaking in that regard. So on the way in to testify on this bill, I decided to stop at a grocery store and just take a peek and take a bunch of photos of what products I saw on the shelf. And I would like just to demonstrate to you the variety of things that in theory at that point were already supposed to be standardized. Sell by, EY something or other, lot something expire, best before, enjoy by, nothing, just the date. And here something, I'm not quite sure how you define that, and expire, I think I duplicated that. Anyway, the point is that, and I have a bunch of other photos, that's just a sampling of the photos, that it's just all over the place, even though it was supposed to be voluntarily already in place. So another thing that a lot of consumers are confused by is how long and where, not how long, but where should they store their food when they bring it home from the grocery or the farmer's market. And Seattle Public Utilities has this absolutely fabulous guide that I recommend to people big time. It's a food storage chart, and this is just a piece of it. And it shows you really well, really nicely how to store your food. I personally thought that apples should be stored on the counter. It turns out that apples should be stored in the fridge. And maybe some of you already knew that, but I didn't. And so it's really great because it does actually clarify things for you, and maybe other members of your family or friends and colleagues. All right, let's turn briefly to feeding hungry people as the second strategy category. I'm not going to say a ton here because this is not an area that we have a lot of expertise. We really do look to Food Lifeline and the food groups, the food rescue groups, as the leaders on this. But I do draw your attention to what happened during the pandemic. This was the potato situation, which I'm sure you read about or saw on the media. We had farmers who wanted to give, they had a whole ton of potatoes that were packaged in such a way that they would go to commercial buyers, large bags, as you can see here. And they were about to toss them all and they were going to lose money. And what happened is there was a huge volunteer effort. I think it was a woman in Woodinville who may have been the first one that started it off, and a big old volunteer effort to rescue the potatoes and bring them to people who were hungry. It was an awesome thing. But one of the issues was how the material was packaged. This is old, but I don't think it's probably going to be too out of date. In fact, it may be even worse, which is from 2014, the rate of food insecurity among the children in our counties in Washington state. Not a pretty picture. what happened is, this is a year before. So I mentioned that Rep. Delio had a bill last year. This is a bill that she introduced, and this bill passed, HB 1114. And we worked on it with the Hunger Rescue Group, the food rescue groups as well. And this was to set a goal for Washington that matched the Obama administration. So 50% reduction in food waste by 2030 relative to 2015 levels. So stepping back a little bit because this was passed in 2019. And then also requiring ecology to develop and adopt a state wasted food reduction and food waste aversion plan. So this was definitely a really good step. Ecology has been working on this. This is one of the meetings. There's been stakeholder meetings. They call it now the Use Food Well Washington Plan. And then here is a report that they did in November. It was supposed to be completed in November, as in last November, but it was not because of COVID causing things to slow down. But this will be completed at the end of this year, and it's definitely a very good step of getting people talking to each other about food waste. So like I said, we aren't the lead on the food diversion in that regard, food for hungry people piece. But here's an area that we do work a lot in, and that has to do with organic waste. Let's start off by looking at Washington's waste characterization study. This is done every 5 years. This one was done for 2015, and these are their slides. And they are now doing a 2021, which will be very interesting to see because it would be during the pandemic to see what their results are. This is their graph, but it shows that organic material to the landfill, this is not recycled, this is not compost, this is to the landfill by all sectors 4 seasons, was 28.5%, which matches what Domenic was saying on a national scale. And here is the same information, but shown a different way, which is the top 15 most prevalent material types. I boxed the edible and inedible food. The appendix of the document shows that the food that is edible is very clearly defined as edible. And here's the punchline. The punchline is that 17% by weight going to our landfill is food waste, and about half of that is edible food, which is completely criminal. We got to deal with this. And then the inedible food should be made into good things for pigs and compost and energy. So I don't want to go over this. You're going to hear more about this from Michael, so I'm not going to talk too much about the benefits of compost. Compost is awesome. And one problem, though, is that in Washington State, we do have very uneven access in terms of what jurisdictions do have the ability for people to either do curbside, which is in blue here, or drop off, like go to a transfer station and drop your material off, or it's just not recycled at all. So you can see that yard trimmings, the top thing here, 153 jurisdictions out of 230 have curbside access for their residents, whereas 87 are drop off, but a full 80% don't even let you do anything with your yard trimmings. Food, soil, paper, a little bit less, and then you can see down the line here. Now, Michael's gonna be talking about your commercial compost. This is one elsewhere in Washington State. And the only reason I show this is just to say that, you know, the material coming in is yard waste and food waste at this particular facility. You can see the top photo, it goes into that shed, then it gets chopped up a little bit and put into windrows, which are go for 90 days. Air is pumped in and then flipped another 90 days and makes a luscious compost product. But when you look up close at that product, you do see a lot of plastic in it. So that one of the big problems with our compost system is commercial compost system is the issue about plastics and lookalike products. So you have the compostable and then you have the lookalike products. The consumers are super duper confused. And this is why we're working on other bills related to plastics. And so I'm not going to talk about that today, but the issue about fixing our recycling system, reducing the use of the single-use plastics in the first place, et cetera, all plays into the food waste issue. So we have been working on a brand new report. I was just working on edits on it last night. It will come out at the end, right at the beginning of May. And Michael was one of our interviewees. He was awesome. And we looked at the management right now of the organic waste in Washington, and then what are the barriers and opportunities moving forward. So here are some of the figures. This figure shows you the facilities in Washington State. And here's a facility that shows you the flow of material. This is organic material flowing from one county to the other. And I'm not really wanting you to read these in detail. I'm just giving you a teaser of what's in the report so you can look at the report later. But we do have some material coming from Oregon and from Idaho into Washington. And you can see, of course, the darker color are the more populous areas of the state, which would be consistent with what you would expect. So overall, we found that the barriers to expanding our organic management system in Washington state include logistics, financial burdens and financial risks, regulatory challenges, operational issues. These are all things you would expect, but we go into great detail on these in the report. And one of the big issues we have is the apple maggot problem. We have a pest, which is called an apple maggot in Washington state. I happen to have an apple tree, and I happen to have the apple maggot in my tree because as I was making jam last summer, when I cut open the apples, this is exactly what it looked like. So the state is trying to protect our very valuable apple crop, and so they have quarantine zones, and this has caused a major challenge in terms of our being able to transport the feedstock or the organic material from our side of the state, from the western side of the state, over to the eastern side of the state, where there's a lot of need for the compost, but also just that there would be lots of land and cheap labor and things like that. So this is one of our challenges. Another challenge is a chemical, a pesticide, clopyralid, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, which is partially banned in Washington, but not fully. And the photo you see there is compost that had that in there. It's a pesticide that is used, for example, on hay. And you can see that the tomatoes planted in the compost several years ago were damaged by this chemical. We would like to see this chemical banned in Washington, and there is moves in this direction, like in Oregon and other places. And then another issue, for example, just giving you some examples here, is a lack of procurement requirements. So does the jurisdiction that is creating all of the compost take it back? And unfortunately they don't, and you can see why, because there's plastic and things. These are two examples of how the compost might be used: stormwater, rain garden on the left, and erosion control on the right along the highway. So the report has 36 recommendations. I'm not going to go into all the detail here because this will be coming out in about a week. And one of the things, I'm now going to lead into legislation, and Mike hasn't given me the 5-minute warning, so I guess I'm still good, is that we want to ban organic material, including food waste, in our landfills. Yard waste has already been banned in these states. Food waste has been banned from all sources in Vermont. It's being considered in Maryland, and food waste commercial scale food waste has been banned in some other states. So California has a terrific bill. It was passed in 2016, and it's based on climate change impacts. And what they are basically, and it went into effect in 2020, and believe me, it's going into effect. I've been on all sorts of webinars about this. 50% reduction of organic waste to the landfill by 2020 relative to 2014, and 75% by 2025. And then separately, there's a target of a 20% reduction by 2022. This is very dramatic. It is making all sorts of havoc, and I'm sure Michael could speak to this, in California, because all sorts of things had to happen to make this happen. But they are busily working on it down there. And of course, we have lessons learned that we can apply here from how this has gone. So now we're talking about legislation here in Washington. This session just now, the one that concluded on Sunday, Senator Mona Das had a bill related to setting a goal like that California bill, but it was a conversation starter bill. It was not intended to do anything this session, not to move, but to basically get the conversation started. And this summer, pretty soon, now that session is over, we're going to start stakeholder conversations about a big bill like the California bill for next year. And any of you who are interested, who are like, for example, Michael there, you are invited to, and Domenic, invited to participate in this. I don't know if Domenic can, since he works for a federal agency. So it'll set a goal for reduction of organic material to the landfill, but it won't be like 100% goal. It's going to be a goal of X% relative to a date certain. And then the thing is we've got to provide funding and incentives, all the things that go with that. You can't just set a goal and walk away. You've got to really think it through carefully and do a good job on that. And that was a large part of the reason for our report. And but what did pass is a budget proviso. This was I got the happy email on this a couple of days ago. So in the budget that they released on Saturday, a $331,000 study that WSU will do. The first one is to develop a model to estimate carbon sequestration. So what is the benefit in terms of using organic waste derived soil amendment application, in other words, compost, but I guess to some degree digestate. And then secondly, to look at how the local and state governments are doing in terms of purchasing and using the compost, to do a little bit of a deep dive into that. That report will be due by December 31st, 2022, but we're still moving ahead with the bill for next January.
So Heather, could you wrap up?
I am done.
Yeah. You're done.
You forgot to give me the 5-minute warning. Ours, this is the same as Domenic's hierarchy, just a simpler version. Let's prevent the waste. Let's make it into good stuff. Let's feed people, and let's not landfill it. And thank you. And I will quit.
Wow. Perfect.
Sorry, I ran over if I ran over.
No, that was perfect. Thank you. As always, Heather, for those who haven't worked in the environmental field here, she's a legend in the area. So thank you, Heather, for shifting. I know I used to work with Heather on toxics, and now she's doing this. So thank you very much. So Michael, take it away. Tell us who you are and then go for it.
Okay, yes, Michael Bryan-Brown. I'm president of Green Mountain Technologies, and I appreciate so much what Domenic and Heather have done in laying out the groundwork. And there's some surprising overlaps between our presentations, and I'll be basically doing a deeper dive into a couple of the topics that they both talked about. Let's see, wasn't it not scrolling? There we go. I started Green Mountain Technologies back in 1992 in Vermont, and we moved to Bainbridge in 2001. And one of the first community programs that we got involved was Islandwood, and Islandwood was just started a year before, and they were looking for a compost system to demonstrate to the students that came through their program how food waste could be recycled. They put together a great program. They had scales that they put on the table, so the students, the kids would be able to see every day how much food waste they were wasting versus what they were eating and what kind of portions they were serving. It was a very effective program. At the end of the week, they would be wasting less than a quarter of what they wasted the first day. And so it's been a really successful program that they've put together there, and it actually has benefited our company because a lot of the students who were going through that program in 2002 are now 25, 30 years old, and a number of them have been to college, and they've encouraged colleges to put in composting systems. And so it's been good for our business and even better for the environment. We also have facilities on several of the farms, EOS Ranch, Heyday Farm, and we just started a facility for Blodell Reserve. So we're doing a lot of work locally, but we do a lot of work nationally and internationally. Let's see if I can get this to scroll. Now, the food waste hierarchy, I'm so glad that Domenic brought that up, and Heather was referring to the same thing. All of these programs like source reduction, feeding hungry people are, the way to go and much better than composting. But unfortunately, there's a large segment of food that ends up being wasted, and will go into the municipal waste collection system. And I'm going to make a case here that composting is the best alternative. So when you look at composting and you look at the minimization of impacts, residential backyard composting is by far the best way to go. So if people are willing to do it, and I am willing to do it, I run my own backyard composting operation here, and for the business too, that has the lowest impacts. But unfortunately, the adoption rate for that is fairly low. Last data I saw was somewhere around between 10 and 15% of households are willing to do their own backyard composting. So that means that likely 85% of food waste that ends up in the municipal waste stream that's considered waste and not capturable through food banks is going to end up in a curbside collection program. So the cities, we've worked with several different cities and municipalities that have centralized composting, including City of Portland, San Francisco, City of Phoenix. We've worked with all those programs to put in centralized composting operations. So that's a good alternative, and as Heather said, that is probably where the largest portion of food waste is going to get captured. One alternative for island communities is to do community composting or distributed composting. We have several examples of that we've done on Bainbridge. So in terms of on-site composting, there's probably a half dozen of these earth cube systems scattered around the island. And the earth flow, which is a more automated system, is located at two facilities, one at Hayday Farm, which is one of these auger agitated systems. And then Blodell Reserve just started up a what we call ASP, or aerated static pile system, for their horticultural waste. And Blodell Reserve is gearing up to be an example facility for the island and for horticultural reserves in general. They want to be carbon neutral and then carbon negative. And we're just formulating those goals now. And the composting is a big part of that program. We also did equipment for Olympic Organics, which takes quite a large portion of the organic waste from Bainbridge Island and the greater Kitsap Peninsula. And we also did work almost 30 years ago now for Purdy Topsoil, which is down near Gig Harbor. So these are examples of some of our centralized facilities that we worked on. So this is Dirt Hugger, which is down in Dallasport. And if you looked at one of Heather's arrows that went down to that Klickitat County, that's where Dirt Hugger is. And they take a fair portion of City of Portland's food waste. And then the Recology is a really progressive waste company in California. They have operations in Portland and in Seattle also. And we're designing, or have just started up, 2 large facilities for them, which are 1,500 tons a day at the facility in Tracy, California. So that's taking a large portion of the city of San Francisco's waste. And also in a facility north of Sacramento that's taking a lot of Sacramento's organic waste. And so when we talk about California, California realized probably about 5 years ago that if they were serious about their climate initiatives, and they are more serious than any other state in our nation, that they passed SB 1383, State Bill 1383, which basically said that they had to ban organic waste from landfills by 2025. And these facilities in California are being built at a rapid rate to try to meet that mandate. California's serious about it, and hopefully the EPA will find ways to make it a national mandate instead of just a regional or state mandate. So we're talking about aerobic composting. So there are anaerobic digestion alternatives. We're not involved with that aspect of food waste management or recycling. So in an aerobic process, briefly, you need to blend green waste and food waste together, and you need to deliver air. And delivering air is very important for maintaining an aerobic process, and all the benefits you get from composting of organic waste really are hinged on that idea of maintaining an aerobic environment. If you don't maintain an aerobic environment, you're going to generate methane. Doesn't matter whether that material is in a composting pile that's anaerobic or in a landfill that's anaerobic. You have to maintain your process in order to succeed in having the greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So typically, the ultimate goal is a soil amendment, which is going to help make our planet greener. So for those longtime Bainbridge Islanders, remember Bainbridge Graduate Institute, and there was a student there that did a case study for Vashon. So I thought it was interesting to refer back to it. Also, the Zero Waste group just went and toured Vashon yesterday. But this is done about 5 years ago, and Vashon was considering, how to manage their organic waste. The funny thing about Vashon is even though it's a very progressive community and it's part of King County, and King County has one of the highest recycling rates in the nation, but Vashon has a recycling rate of something like 9%. It may have gotten better in the last 5 years. But even though they have a very environmental green-minded community, they only capture a small percentage because they don't have the programs in place to be able to divert that waste. So when you look at the organic fraction, so I think this is a good indication also of how the waste fraction splits down for Bainbridge, given the islands are fairly similar in characteristic, is that 47% of the waste stream on Vashon is biodegradable and considered to be possible to compost through aerobic composting. So all of those feedstocks can go into essentially an aerobic composting system. An anaerobic composting system, which is generating methane for energy consumption, really can only take up to 20% of this pie. So the aerobic composting is much more flexible in its range of materials that you can feed into it. They did essentially a final scoring for different feasibilities for 4 different alternatives, and the highest ranking was for community composting when they looked at either digestion or having other types of facilities on the island. So I'm going to fly through these slides. Another case study, which I think is really cool case, is up in Gibson's Landing, which is up in the Sunshine Coast in DC. And this guy's a totally committed, nutty, driven zero waster. He started Zero Waste Canada, and he runs this facility here. And essentially they had styrofoam extruders, glass crushers, and he was capturing just in this one facility 55% of the solid waste coming out of this community. Just he was so determined. He had a large drop-off facility that Canadians, really embraced. He had a recovery center and all sorts of other operations in these containers, and he would sort every piece of garbage he could get his hands on. He put in one of our original prototype earth flow system there in order to capture another 40%. So when he put in composting, he got up to 95% capture for that community. So it's a great model of what you can be doing with zero waste. I'm going to skip over this one. This is Gray Bears, which is another food recovery center, one of the oldest in the country, down in Santa Cruz, and they put in composting in 2001. And I'll make this presentation available so you don't feel like you're missing out on a lot of the presentation here. But they put in one of our systems, and they did composting on site. So any culls from the food bank went into composting, anything they couldn't recycle. So let's see here. So onto the climate change piece, I want to do a little bit deeper dive into greenhouse gases from organic waste. So the two main sources of organic waste, if they're improperly managed organic waste, are methane, as Domenic and Heather mentioned, and also nitrous oxide. So you're talking about something that is a derivative of an ammonia emission from degrading food waste. So the EPA has put together a really awesome waste model called the WARM model, which Dominic's probably familiar with. And it does essentially life cycle analysis, or LCA modeling for food waste. And so you can make a bunch of assumptions, put it in the model, and the model then decide or help you decide which waste strategy is the best way to go. And so you can compare landfilling versus composting, landfill versus anaerobic digestion, and see which one is going to give you the best bang for your buck in terms of reduction in greenhouse gases. So so methane, they typically say that it's about 30 times more potent. So if you had a single carbon atom that was going into the atmosphere from food waste, and it went in either as CO2 or CH4, methane, an anaerobic process made that carbon into methane, it would be 30 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2. And if you looked at the long-term effects, it's actually 80 times more impactful than CO2 because it's that much more stable in the environment. Nitrous oxide is even more potent, 264 times more potent than CO2. But there's a fairly small amount of that emission coming out of organic waste. So the majority of what we focus on is methane. And generally in these models, they exclude what they call biogenic, or essentially any kind of emissions that would happen regardless of how that waste got treated. So generally the LCA models don't include the biogenic. So we're looking at the anthropogenic aspects of waste management here. So the other thing that Heather mentioned, which was this methane emissions survey done in California, I thought it was really interesting, and I used this in another presentation. So NASA developed a methane sensor that they could put on a plane, and they could fly over the state of California and find out where what the highest methane emitters were. And so it's real-time data. It's not theoretical. It's not even modeled. It's basically, they could see with this instrument methane in the atmosphere. And what they found out was that, as Heather had already said, that solid waste disposal was one of the highest emitters of methane in the state of California. And that data is in part what drove the state to decide that SB 1383 was an important priority for the state of California. You can see that composting is what they refer to as biological treatment. So in that case, if you look at this table here, they flew over 90 composting facilities. They had one that showed up with a methane plume, and they considered it to be really a 0%. So composting compared to landfilling, a huge difference in terms of total methane emissions. Then this shows you like the range also of methane emissions. So you can certainly do a better job of managing landfills. In the case of the Republic Services, that landfill was emitting 3,000 kilograms per hour, which is a huge methane emission. As I mentioned a little earlier, it's really important that how you compost. So you need to maintain an aerobic environment in a compost operation. If you just stack it up in a huge static pile, and it's going to generate methane, and it's not going to be really any different than a landfill. We did a study. This is for a site in Oregon, and they had 5% methane emissions off the surfaces of these piles. So there are over 400 static pile composting operations in the U.S. So converting those into an aerobic process is also a critical goal. I think that the regulators and EPA should be encouraging all systems to be forced aeration for the future. This is more data, really basically making the same case about aeration, and I will skip over that in the interest of keeping it going. So on to life cycle assessment. So the WARM model, and there's a British equivalent called the RATE model. And LCA is a way of, as I mentioned earlier, of making a comparison between different alternatives for waste management. And of course, we're interested in making a comparison between composting or landfilling primarily. And that's what most solid waste planners are interested in looking at also, either anaerobic digestion, composting, or landfilling. So in brief, I'm not going to get into this table in much detail, but you're looking at what are all the inputs going into a composting facility. So the composting facility being the black box here. And so you have water, diesel, electricity as inputs for utilities. You have the waste material going in, and then you have the compost going out, and then all of the emissions of particulate, VOCs, NOx, water vapor, odors. So those are all the outputs, and leachate. And so the LCA models look at all these factors and try and help determine and make a comparison between different solid waste alternatives. As I mentioned, there's two models. The EPA WARM model is the one I used here. And so this is interesting. So the 300,000 ton per year composting facility, so that's about equivalent to Cedar Grove for the city of Seattle in terms of the tons per year processed. And so without going too far into the numbers, a landfill, so if you look, the baseline scenario is a landfill. And so if you say you're going to landfill 300,000 tons of material, the material being food waste and yard trimmings, that's going to generate 18,200 metric ton equivalent of CO2. And then if you looked at composting, so if you composted that same amount, the net effect would be negative 46,000 metric tons of CO2 equivalent discharged. And then if you looked at what that means in terms of, real world comparison, running Cedar Grove and diverting that organic waste for the city of Seattle is equivalent to 13,800 passenger cars being taken off the road. So, this is significant. As Heather said, these are significant emissions, and we can get significant savings just by managing and composting our food waste. And so that I also did a direct comparison. If you looked at composting versus anaerobic digestion, and the composting, according to the Warren model, is more beneficial in terms of metric tons equivalent. And the primary reason being that anaerobic digestion requires a lot of infrastructure in terms of construction and a lot of capital in order to build those plants. And aerobic composting is less infrastructure intensive. And then the one last comparison I took out of the Warren model is that for every ton of food waste that we divert, so whether it's on Bainbridge or anywhere else, equals 0.72 metric tons equivalent of CO2. So for every ton of food waste that we divert is equivalent to almost a ton equivalent of CO2 taken out of our discharge to the environment. So it's significant. By comparison, a typical composting operation, yes, that does require fuel and electricity and other things to make compost. As you can see, we have heavy equipment running around, we've got grinders, we've got all this stuff happening at a composting facility. But that only adds up to about 30 pounds of CO2 equivalent per ton processed in a composting facility. So you're looking at only 30 pounds of CO2 discharge for energy to make compost versus a savings of over 1,500 pounds of CO2 equivalent by not discharging that methane. And this is a graph that shows where those primary, according to the Warren model, where the primary discharges of GHG equivalents are. So the blue being the baseline or landfill, the primary contributor is the methane that is discharged from the landfill. They get some credit, a landfill, they give an odd credit, which is that you have carbon storage. So you're literally taking organic material and putting it inside of a landfill. So they consider that to be carbon storage. So it's taking it out of the system. And then you can see here, there's a small discharge for dinitrogen monoxide, which is those NOx emissions that I mentioned earlier. But not nearly as significant as the methane impacts from the landfill. And then the CO2, we have CO2 emissions from composting, but the net effect is that compared to landfills, composting wins hands down. There are a couple other factors that aren't considered in the models, which is when you make compost, you actually have something that's going to increase soil fertility, and the soil fertility is going to then increase the ability of plants to grow and to absorb carbon out of the atmosphere. And also, composting replaces fertilizers, which require petroleum products in order to manufacture. So the last, I'm going to close on this slide here, which is that in spite of all the need for food waste diversion and composting, there's a substantial shortage of infrastructure. This is a Wall Street article from 5 years ago. that that even though states really want to promote composting, they're having a hard time getting facilities built. And so that's the critical piece that Heather, I know, is focusing on with Zero Waste Washington, is trying to open the door to get more facilities constructed. And with that, I'll close.
Thank you,
And
Michael.
this presentation will be available also. So,
okay. Yeah, Michael, well, we'll talk at the end about if everybody's comfortable with sharing their presentation. So if you could unshare, Michael, that'd be great.
okay.
So there's a whole bunch of questions, and Deb, in her miracle way, put them in order. So I'll start to read through some of them and try to switch back and forth between everybody, so we can get through a lot of the questions. So the first one is, what can the federal government programs help to do for communities like Bainbridge, where unlike Seattle, we don't have a great program in educating consumers? How do we get programs to our community? So I think that, Dominic, Heather, you probably could both add something there. Any suggestions?
Sure. Yeah. So I was kind of stealing some thunder from the Q&A by putting some information into the chat. But I shared information about the Food Too Good to Waste program for households that EPA helped develop. So I included the webpage for that. So the toolkit and all the resources are on our website. And then I also included the link to King County's adaptation of Food Too Good to Waste, just so you can see how a local government took that and customized it and made it more user-friendly for its residents to use. So, so any city or county government can take that stuff and run with it. It's free and it's available to use. King County also, I'm not sure if they still have that stuff up on their website or not, but they created some videos. I don't know if you have any PCC community markets over there, but they worked with their chef to develop some videos to the chef that teaches their cooking classes to illustrate how you can reuse leftovers or food scraps to make other meals, or not have to discard it, and just other kind of like helpful tips in terms of menu planning and planning shopping and meals for the week, so that people can be a little bit more intentional about preventing food waste at home. Unfortunately, the years of us having grant dollars to provide to local governments, that those are mostly gone. We actually do have a this year, for the first time in probably a decade, we have a grant solicitation that's open for a few more days until I think it's midnight Eastern time on the 30th, so 3 days from now. Those are grant dollars for materials management projects, which could include local level food waste prevention or food recovery projects. So that might be something that, if you are savvy enough at putting together a grant application, still a few more days left to do that. And then also we are supporting, this is a little bit of an aside, but supporting anaerobic digestion technology. We have a large pot of money. The solicitation isn't actually even out yet, but the request for proposals will be coming out in a few weeks from EPA nationally. And I think we have about $2.2 million that's going to be just open to any state or local or tribal government or nonprofit that wants to apply. If they have any good ideas on how to implement anaerobic digestion projects at the local level, or anything innovative, they're welcome to apply. And that's obviously a lot more money. Here at the regional level, I think we have something like 120,000 available. So that's going to be very, very competitive.
Okay, so that's great. And Heather, there's a question, you talked about legislation. But why do you think there's resistance, if there is in Washington, for moving forward on, let's say, the bills that you were talking about? What's the pushback?
Well, a couple things. First off, let me just answer that first question also. The big old bill we're working on for next year for compost and the big old bill we're working on for plastics for next year, January 2022, both would include components of education at the local level. So first off, there's just always generally going to be, resistance by various interests against more regulations or more government. So there's that, which you always have on any bill that, is an environmental bill. But the bigger issue for the compost and organic materials effort is money. And the great thing about that is that the climate change bills that just passed the legislature on Sunday and Saturday include components in there to help fund clean things. In other words, getting material out of the landfill is going to be something that's going to qualify. So that was part of the strategy, was those bills are going to work hand in hand with the idea of now needing to do funding and incentives and grants to realize this expansion to get the material out of the landfill, which is we feel like we should just simply frame it like they did in California as a climate change bill, the organics bill.
Okay, thanks. Here's one very local, and is the compost that Bainbridge Island disposal picks up processed aerobically, anaerobically?
I could answer that. Are you saying that the operation at Tills, or the material that's taken and collected and taken off island?
I think taken off island, Fran, taken off island, yeah.
Yeah, it's composted aerobically, or at least the portion that goes to Olympic Organics, and Diane might know a breakdown of what the split is between commercial and non-commercial. A portion of it goes also to a facility in Belfair, North Mason Fiber, and I'm not exactly sure what technology they use there. They may be doing static pile, but it's certainly being composted. I'm not sure if they've used forced aeration or not.
Okay. And another question is, and I think, Heather, you mentioned going to the Seattle Public Utilities sign. Just in general, what's your advice on data labeling? I think everybody's confused. And what would you advise, other than going to that site, which I think is probably good? Anything you or Domenic could advise on data labeling?
When you say data, well, so I guess I'm a little confused. The bill that we were working on had that actual language in there. That's date labeling. Is that what you meant?
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's what we would advise, is to have that standard language, one related to water, one related to food quality, and one related to food safety. And I did see a note in there that they should be different colors. That's a great idea. I love that, John. And that is in line with what they, in theory, are going to do at the national level. In the meantime, if you do have a product in your fridge that is got a date on it, and you think that it's an old date, that your nose is unbelievably sensitive to be able to smell things. I mean, don't go crazy bad here, but your nose is super duper good at figuring out whether something is good or bad. And some of us are more willing to push the envelope than others. Or you can microwave it or cook it. I can see Susan going like laughing. Yeah, anyway, but it's all about selling more product. They want you to think it's expired, and they want you to throw it away and get something new.
Okay, here's one on composting. How's supply and demand working for compost? Do we have too much in this area, too little? Who's buying it?
Yeah, so the main outlet for the Western Washington is the landscape and new house construction markets. And so the composting industry does swing with the real estate industry in terms of the demand for product use. Fortunately, the state has taken on some initiatives with the Department of Transportation to require a certain percentage of organic matter and soils on road banks and cuts along our highways. And so that's helping to make more demand on Western Washington. Anytime you get close to agriculture, like the dirt hugger facility down in Dallasport, which is very close to a lot of the crop production along the Hood River and the Columbia, anytime you get close to those, the markets are huge, and the same is true in California. Once you move that organic waste away from the main urban areas and you get close to any agriculture, that product's got tons of demand.
Yeah, Fran, that's what our report articulates in the charts and graphs. Where's the supply, where's the demand? And then the problem that I mentioned before about the transport, we have a lot of supply over here on the west side, and the east side needs it, and yet we have the apple maggot issue.
Here's one. What do you think we need to do on Bainbridge with respect to composting and food waste management? I think this is probably towards you, Michael, but Dominic or Heather could chime in. Any thoughts on that?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
What do you think we need to do on Bainbridge with respect to composting and food waste management? What would you recommend on how we can move forward on those?
Yeah, I think that for Bainbridge, relatively, there's a limited amount of food waste that really is being generated on Bainbridge, and I think continuing to encourage people to take responsibility for their backyard composting is still the best alternative, and see if we can move the needle there. And then the co-collection of the green waste with the food waste. I think that there's some resistance from North Mason Fiber to taking the commingled food waste, green waste. But that program in Seattle and King County has been hugely successful, and it's a very convenient way for that material to be captured. And so I would encourage Bainbridge Disposal, if they can't find an outlet with that material going to North Mason Fiber, that they look for another alternative. And then the local institutional programs like what is happening at Islandwood and what we did at the high school, I think if those initiatives can get more traction, and you can capture those food waste generators that are concentrated, I think that's really the best alternative.
Okay. And Dominic and Heather, what do you think? I mean, if you're giving advice to us on Bainbridge and then to our city council and to the city staff, what 2 or 3 things would you advise us to do to kind of move forward on food waste issues?
Well,
go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Dominic. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, because such a large percentage does come from households, I would say if the county government can look at providing more information to households on how they can prevent food waste from being generated in the first place through some of the great resources that are out there. I was going to mention that the Food to Go to Waste program also has a bunch of tools that they've developed so that to help households measure how much food waste they're generating every month. And then, it has, resources to help them with, menu planning and shopping and taking an inventory of what you've got at home. I think it's probably a great idea. The graphic that was provided earlier in the presentation, to have the food storage graphic on your fridge, to be able to have that kind of top of mind. All that stuff I think can be used to help individuals, consumers, be able to make a real impact.
Thanks. So Heather, I think you have last word here.
Oh, good. Okay. So we're basically talking about a norm shift. We need to norm shift in the home and businesses, but basically the home in terms of your sort of thinking about food waste. And as Dominic said, the SPU guide is super great. I mean, I thought I was pretty good on this stuff, and I sure wasn't. So one is that. 2 is, you have this wonderful, wonderful trash on fashion show. What if you did some sort of very cool, chef cook-off, use zero waste and use up all your, using up all the things in your fridge. Like, don't even go to the store. You're only going to use the stuff that's in someone's house, and say, okay, I'm only going to make this fabulous meal just from what you already have in your home. So something like that, where you're kind of really getting that use up the food waste thing. And then lastly, bottom line, I was on a call earlier today, it's the youth. if you have the teenagers saying this is something we got to deal with, it will happen. And so if you can get the youth, I don't know what, something creative, but if it's the youth saying do it, it'll happen a lot faster.
Can I,
Well, that was
can I just,
great.
can I
Dominic?
just tag onto that real quick?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think another thing that would be really interesting would be, I know that I think it was about 2 years ago, we had one of the kind of top restaurateur chefs here in Seattle, John Howe. He partnered with King County, and he created this meal from. It was a dinner, and it was free to whoever signed up for it. It was sort of limited number of people, but he took food that would have been tossed, food that was recovered, and donated, and he but it was basically a cooking class and a sit down dinner all in one. It was called the Food Too Good to Waste Feast. And that drew a lot of really great attention to the topic, and it's really fun for folks to try to learn those concepts. So that's something that you could look into having happen over on Bainbridge as well.
That's great. So, well, good. So Diane, I'm wondering, some of the ideas and some of the resources, are they on the zero waste site now? Or could we put, excuse me, Dominic, I have allergies too, so I can relate to what you're saying. I'm losing my voice here. Put on, maybe some of those resources are already there. Can we put some of those on then?
Yeah, we do have some already. And yes, I can add some that were posted tonight too.
Okay, that'd be great. So Diane, Deb, anything, last words you want to say, or?
Just a big fat thank you to all our speakers. That was wonderful. And to the great questions.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Congratulations, Deb, on the award.
That was great. You gave us a broad view with specifics. Is very, very good. So really thank everybody and for coming, and especially the speakers. And I know this is after hours, so to speak, but I think we learned a lot, and let's give them a hand. Yay. So we're going to take some of these ideas, hopefully, and we can work obviously with zero waste, but the climate change advisory committee is always looking for ideas on how we can work closer with the city and other agencies to reduce our food waste. And as Dominic said at the very beginning, 13% of our greenhouse gases in the United States are coming from food waste. And then if you expand the bubble, not just the food waste, but the production, and we didn't even get into the food itself in terms of the diet we have. That's a whole nother issue. That's another forum that we're going to try to hold on that side of the equation. So anyway, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And everybody have a nice evening.
Thanks, Mike.
Good night. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.